there's not a day that goes by that we don't deal with our national security issues or we don't see things happening. And I think we need to be aware, we need to be in tune. And throughout this, there's been a Sons of Issachar kind of perspective that I've looked at it as, and saying, again, they were men who understood their times and they knew what to do. And so again, part of our mission at Cure is to really try to help you know what to do and understand what's going on. So without further ado, this morning we have Dr. Paul Courier to my far right. He covers foreign affairs, with a focus on Eurasia for Forbes, and is a contributing editor for The Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy, published by Institute for Religion and Democracy. He has joined us before in a briefing, and he's been around, and he's just fascinating, and he's given me a lot of that report that I mentioned, The Providence, a journal for Christianity, has been one of those things that have just promoted and provoked my thought process on several different things. So I really appreciate that. And he's a guy that probably you could spend hours with just talking and chatting, and it's just fascinating. And so we appreciate him being here this morning. And so we welcome him. We also, right to my right here, is Mr. Frank Gaffney. Now, Mr. Gaffney, I like Mr. Gaffney, and I like Paul too. So whenever you say that, the other person says, "Oh, you don't like me." No, but I like Mr. Paul too. But because, some may say, man, he stirs up the nest. And the thing about what's going on in our country is that the nest needs to be stirred up. And we need to understand that there are issues that are happening that if we're just, I always, and hear me, this is not deep, okay? I'm going to say a not deep statement. Everybody's seen The Matrix, right? Somebody seen The Matrix way back when? Anybody gone to movies before? That's okay. But I always go back to The Matrix when it's red pill, blue pill, long time ago. Some may not have seen it. And you could take one and be just glazed over into this whole sphere and act like stuff doesn't exist. Or you take the other one and you wake up. And I think he's one of those guys that keep giving us that pill, wake up. Because these are real issues that are happening. He runs and the president of the Center for Security Policy in D.C. The center is a nonprofit for nonpartisan education corporation established in 1988. But under his leadership, the center has been nationally and internationally recognized as a source for timely, informed, penetrating analysis of foreign and defense policy matters. He again, another fascinating person. But I'm telling you, some of the stuff that you're going to hear, probably going to say, is that really real? And I'm telling you, you need to listen up in this session. And to that end, he's also brought a letter for faith leaders in America that I think we're going to learn more about and give us even an opportunity. Perhaps if you're interested later on, you could look at it and read it, and that's great. As well, there's an explanatory memorandum, Muslim Brotherhood in America, really interesting as well. Another booklet that we're going to be able to get in your hands, and I think that's awesome. And their center has also been one of the other great people that are sponsoring this event for us and really helping us to put it on and to get in front of you. So we want to applaud them and applaud both of them. So can we welcome them? So a lot of mouthful to say to get into the conversation. So thank you for being patient. But this morning, we've talked about a myriad of issues over the last couple of days here, and it's been really interesting, and these folks are ready for you. But help us understand. I'm almost like a guy that I feel like I could push a button and say go and let you guys just go at it. But there are issues, like I said, every day, national security. Help us understand what's really going on, what's below the surface of all the media hype.
Questions? I could start with a big picture, and then Frank could speak more to Islamism, if you want to. Excuse me. I think big picture is something that and I know Frank would agree with me on this because we've talked about this. Our national security bureaucracy in Washington, our State Department, tends to be populated by people that are, I would even say, aggressively secular in their worldview. And so they don't understand how spirituality and religion can shape national identities and cultures. Wow. And how important it is to peoples around the world, and therefore how important that is for Americans to understand in order to understand seismic strategic shifts going on around the world right now. We tend to, our secular foreign policy, national security elites tend to distill humanity down to material concerns because they're secular. So They understand national interests in material terms and people's interests in material terms. It's a desire for wealth, power, and security, and that's pretty much it. They don't understand or appreciate how transcendental concerns and deeper spiritual concerns can motivate peoples, not just nation states, but non-state actors as well. We obviously see this with ISIS, Daesh, with Al-Qaeda, et cetera. So that, I think, is one of the most important underlying factors that are certainly here in Washington our elites don't realize. And I think much of our public doesn't realize that too, but it's vitally important. I'll give you just a couple of stats, and then I'll throw it over to Frank, and we can go back and forth. Few people realize that when you look at as national security threat levels, we tend to look at bellicosity, at big-time nationalism like the Russians and the Chinese, and that is indeed an indicator. The fact that they're not status quo powers, those are all valid indicators of potential national security threat. However, I would argue that a more important one, and one that comes before all of those, would be looking at how each of those states treat religious freedom. Those states over the past 15 to 20 years that have cut down on religious freedom, that have embraced religious intolerance, have almost in every case been states with whom we have come to blows, or they are on our threat matrix as threats. Even those states that are supposedly allies, allies from hell, like Pakistan or Saudi Arabia, are states that also have severe restrictions on religious freedom. And then when you look at states like China, like Russia, where the Russian Orthodox Church has partnered with Vladimir Putin to push a very virulent form of Russian nationalism that is based on their sense of their calling as God's people. You can see how they pushed all other faith practices out of the public square in Russia. Same thing is happening in China. When I lived there, I met with house church leaders and university students that were Christians that would have to meet undercover lest they be imprisoned. And we've seen after Xi Jinping has taken power that he has cracked down even harder, which tells me that China and Russia are both feeling, those governments are both feeling insecure. If they have to crack down on all dissent, they're not secure in their leadership. So I could go on for quite a while. I'll stop it there. Those are some underlying factors.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a perfect segue, actually, to what I wanted to talk to you about. I feel the hand of God is on me on this occasion as I was flying in from Dallas about 45 minutes ago, thinking this was going to be a very close call, but everything worked perfectly. And it's a perfect send-up to another act of God that I'm hoping will inform you going forward from here. In 2004, about 30 miles from here, on a major artery you may be familiar with, the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, a traffic stop took place when a police officer observed a woman doing what lots of people do on that bridge, taking photographs, usually of the seascape, only she was taking pictures of the structural supports of the bridge. And the police officer thought that didn't look right, pulled them over, ran the IDs, determined that her husband, who was driving the car, was wanted on a material witness arrest warrant out of Chicago in connection with fundraising for a designated terrorist organization known as Hamas. That gave rise to a search warrant, which the FBI executed on their home about 10 miles from here in Annandale, Virginia, a little sleepy suburb of Washington. When they went inside this sort of suburban ranch house, it was packed to the gills with banker boxes full of documents. Turned out they'd found the archives of the Muslim Brotherhood in North America. One of the documents, which we have reprinted, and I'm pleased to be able to provide you here, is, to my way of thinking, really the single most important book on the war we're in at the moment, because it was written by them. And you all know the Muslim Brotherhood. You've been hearing about them a lot, particularly since they took over the government of Egypt. What you don't know, probably, and most of us don't, frankly, including most of the people up the block from here and throughout this official community. Partly, I think, because, as Paul says, they've got a sort of secular filter. Partly because, in some cases at least, they've got actually a sympathy for the kind of anti-Americanism if not actual Islamic supremacism, that these guys are all about. But why I wanted to share this with you, and why I think the hand of God, again, is on this meeting, is I believe you are in the front lines of the fight these guys are waging against our country. They call their mission in this document, and this was, by the way, written in 1991, 25 years ago, 25 years after they started working here, by a top Muslim Brotherhood operative who was reporting back. This was not meant for our consumption, folks. This was a report back to the mothership in Egypt about how they were coming. In connection with their mission, which is described by this Muslim Brotherhood leader as, quote, destroying Western civilization from within by their hands, meaning ours, and the hands of the believers, so that Allah's religion is made victorious over all other religions. What the rest of the book tells you is how they're doing it. And in the interest of time, I'll be very brief. They're doing this in your communities as a microcosm of what they're doing across the country. For example, their civilization jihad, as they call it, is really a stealthy kind of, it's like termites, undermining our society by attacking the structure, the civil society institutions, as well as our governing agencies. They're attacking your churches. Have you noticed? They're marrying your women. They're converting your men in prison. They're coming back into your communities, and they're trying to turn them into enclaves of jihadism, Islamic supremacism. Now, people may say, well, I don't see any signs of violence. That's not the point. It's not that these guys are nonviolent, as Paul knows. These are people who believe in violence. Hamas is one of their operations, and that's a very aggressive terrorist organization. Ask our friends in Israel. But what they're doing here, folks, is laying the groundwork for the violent jihad through what they call, really, the civilization jihad. I call pre-violent jihad. So what I'd love to visit with you in the course of this conversation is how they're doing it and how successful it is. And if, in the end, you agree that this is a problem, I'd urge you to join the two initial co-signers. And we're just launching this here, folks. I'm very pleased to have Rabbi Hausman, John Hausman, in from Boston, one of the signers, a great pastor. Rabbi Hausman told me something I didn't know about him. He's a remarkable man, very courageous, a leader in his faith community, but also more broadly in ours. And he has in his synagogue every Sunday a black church that meets in his facility. So he's a man you're going to want to get to know too. So Derek, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Boy, so many directions to go. As I'm sitting here thinking, Paul, you begin to make the direct tie when you're talking about religious liberty and terrorist groups. And, you know, really, we look at a religious liberty threat in our churches and around our country that's beginning to be more and more escalated. How does that fit and help us understand maybe a little bit more clear the tie between those religious liberties and churches and then these Muslim groups that are in our communities, and what should we be doing?
Well, first of all, I would second completely what Frank said, that you all are on the front lines, people in ministry in the United States are on the front lines, because, and this relates to what you just asked, much of the struggle that we see today is about a sense of national identity and an overt attempt to undermine our culture from within. American culture, historically, and our national identity has always been grounded, no matter what the left says. I'm sorry, but it's always been grounded in Judeo-Christian values. That has been fundamental to all of our freedoms. And if we allow those to be undermined at home, we will not be able to be that beacon of freedom and light, to sound smarmy like Reagan, who I loved, and you know, that the world needs us to be. Mm-hmm. And we are not going to be able, if we can't defend those at home, we're not going to be able to, like I said, emit those and champion those values abroad. And we're not going to be able to, we need to defend them first against the encroachments at home on the part of many of our own governing elites, but we also need to defend them against this attempt from jihadists that are here inside our country to undermine us from within.
Can I just pick up on that?
Absolutely.
Because, again, a perfect segue. One of the other things, and you sort of alluded to it in your talk about the Million Man March and your struggle about how do you deal with these guys. And let me be clear, I'm not talking about all Muslims. I'm talking about the Muslims who embrace a doctrine they call Sharia.
That's what I was going to ask.
And Sharia is a doctrine that is, as Paul says, absolutely antithetical to everything in Judeo-Christian beliefs and values, traditions, freedoms, and their expression in our Constitution and way of life. So let's be clear, the ones that espouse that, the ones that believe it's God's will that they impose it worldwide are our implacable enemies. The ones that don't can be our friends, and many have been, but many of them are being drawn, particularly when they see what bin Laden used to call the strong horse, the rising power of these guys, in part because of the embrace and the legitimation and the support, the funding, in some cases even the arming, the Muslim Brotherhood has received from the Obama administration. But let me just bring this home, folks. This is a struggle for you in particular, because as you may know, one of the most insidious, one of the most aggressively pursued facets of this civilization jihad, this assault on our civil society institutions, is being done under the rubric of something they call interfaith dialogue. And anybody been asked to be a bridge builder here? Bridge building is the other meme that they use. They're just in this for bridge building. Let me just tell you a quick story. As you know, Paul, one of the most influential ideologues of the Muslim Brotherhood, a man by the name of Sayyid Qutb, who interestingly enough became profoundly Islamic supremacist because he came to, I think it was Wyoming or Colorado, to do a course of study, and he was horrified at young people dancing together and other kinds of immorality. So he went home to Egypt and he became this virulent Islamist. And one of the things that he specifically says in this book, Milestones, which you often find when a jihadist is killed, they're carrying a copy of it. It's that important to their movement. He describes bridge building in the following way. It's a little bit more flowery, but this is the essence of it. He said the chasm between the faithful and the unbelievers, the kufirs, is so vast that no bridge can be built to span it except for the purpose of bringing the infidel to Islam. So when you're asked to bridge build, when you're asked to engage in interfaith dialogue, when you're asked to do what John Houseman does, except it's opening your churches up to Muslim worship, this, ladies and gentlemen, is about bringing your congregants to Islam, not a genuine Abrahamic faith ecumenicalism. Be on guard, and more to the point, we need you to help push back, because this is part of that termites attack on the faith community, and they use the faith community to protect them against what is blatantly obvious. They're not about faith, folks. They're about this political totalitarian agenda that is intolerant in the extreme and is about crushing these other faiths so that Allah's religion is victorious over all others.
Let me ask you a quick question, Paul, because I just want to break this down. There's a few different things I'm thinking about, but help me understand, what is Sharia law? And I know that's a very simple thing, but to some of us haven't heard it.
Yeah, well, I can give you a brief overview, but actually Frank would be more qualified to answer this because he's looked at it for a lot more years than I have.
Overview.
But in short, Sharia law is a body of Islamic law that's been developed over time. And it's rooted in the fact that Islam, as it began historically, I'm not a historian, so I always go back to history. You can't understand the here and now unless you understand history. And Islam cannot be separated as a faith community from its political implications because it began as a way of life, as a civilization. It's not actually a religion, it's a civilization. It's different.
Wow.
Religion is part of it, but it's a civilization, meaning it has political implications. You can't separate the two out. That's why it's so difficult for Muslims to come here to the United States or to Western countries and to fit within the Western liberal tradition of constitutionalism in the United States, because there's a fundamental conflict with what Islam is.
Okay.
It's great. Here's the further detail. As I'm hoping all of you know, the practice of Islam follows the perfect Muslim's example, Muhammad's, his life, which was a trajectory, which went from when he was poor and essentially powerless man telling people about his visions in Mecca, to when he became a powerful and very successful warlord in Medina. In Mecca, the visions he was getting, we're told, from Allah via Gabriel, were be loving to the people of the book. When he made the first hijrah, as they call it, fleeing Mecca to Medina, when he got powerful in Medina, Allah was telling him, kill the people of the book. Several generations after he passed, his followers were left to try to figure out, so which was it? Love him or kill him? Among other inconsistencies. The early passages of the Quran versus the later passages. And Sharia was born of this effort to square the circle. And they came up with a very simple principle that has worked like a top ever since. It's called abrogation. And what that simply means is what came after was better than and replaced what went before. So if you actually follow the chronology of the Quran and the teachings of Islam as codified in Sharia, it is perfectly clear. It's all the bad stuff that Allah was telling Muhammad, allegedly, at the end, that replaced and negated that love the people of the book stuff. So what we have in Sharia, Paul's absolutely right, is a comprehensive program that is supposed to govern all aspects of a faithful Muslim's life. You could think of it as having a kind of veneer or patina of religiosity to it. Yeah. You know, it tells them how to pray and which direction, what to wash, what to eat, and all that. Maybe 10% of it. But if you want to check this out for yourself, you can visit your local Muslim Brotherhood mosque, for example. In their bookstore, they'll have Reliance of the Traveler, which is the authoritative codification of Sharia going back to the 1300s. Or take my word for it, you can find that the rest of it, the rest of that 90% is about power. How you get it, how you exercise it, and to what ends. And that means it's a political, military, legal program, and sadly, Derek, to your point, it is absolutely at odds with our Constitution, our freedoms, our religions, and even the fundamental proposition of tolerance. Even though, as Paul says, the left and the Islamists who are allied together make much of how intolerant we are if we point these facts out.
Right.
Boy, perfect segue, because my thought is, journey with me now that we've heard this, and now we're walking into the U.S. We're seeing so many different things from a U.S. perspective, and then, as you just clearly said, tolerance. It seems like tolerance of Christianity versus tolerance of Muslims in general, it's a world of difference, and it's lopsided now that it's almost
a one-way bridge, man.
Yep. We're seeing this here in the U.S. as well as in Europe. In the last few months, I took a professorship in France at their military academy called Saint-Cyr, and I have a number of friends over there, not just in France, but spread throughout Europe, who are devout Christians, and therefore are an extreme subculture of a subculture of a subculture in Europe, but nevertheless are fighting back. And one of the things that they have noted over there, and that I think we can see here as well, is that there is a major disconnect in the tolerance levels of both communities. And Christians in the West, cultural Christians, let me rephrase that, particularly in Europe, have a sense that Western civilization is so undermined morally by its sins, real and imagined, that it's not worthy of being defended, and therefore we need to constantly apologize to the Muslims. And we play into the Islamist, not just Muslim, but the Islamist meta-narrative of victimization and of history of aggressive Christianity, bloodthirsty Christianity against the peace-loving Muslims, going back 1,400 years, which is not exactly the real story. But Europeans tend to accept that uncritically. And that's a problem, because that is one of the reasons why European culture and societies are so open to being victimized and terrorized, because they're constantly apologizing for this. A friend of mine, who I know Frank knows as well, Tawfiq Hamid, is an Egyptian MD, former jihadist, who has said in his experience in a jihadi group, he was a member of a jihadi group with Zawahiri, the head of Al-Qaeda. And he said in his experience, every time the West would seek to apologize and try, build bridges, that would be seen as a sign of weakness by the Islamists, not by all Muslims again, but by the Islamists, and that would be used as an attack point. And that's what we're seeing in Europe right now. So one of the things we need to do is we need to, again, as a historian, I've got to harp on history, you've got to understand history. It is far more nuanced and complex than the simplistic version we've been taught, that Christians are, the bloodthirsty people that have killed Muslims for 1,400 years. Not exactly true.
This is such a critical point, if I may just
Yeah,
develop
yeah.
it one more moment. When you hear people talking about the need to accommodate this, not to give offense to it, we dress that up intellectually as, political correctness or diversity sensitivity or multiculturalism. But what Paul's saying is, they perceive it very differently. They have a word for it. They call it submission,
Yes.
which is, as you know, the literal meaning of the word Islam. And that isn't just about the individual Muslim, submitting himself or herself to God. That's part of it, of course. It's about getting everybody else, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, to submit to them. And the leading edge of this, folks, in a way, in addition to that interfaith dialogue business and other assaults on our media, our academics, our culture, our government, and so on, there's an assault on what is, in a way, right up there with freedom of religion, the first and foundational freedom of our country: speech. According to them, according to Sharia, this conversation as an offense against Islam, no matter how truthful what it is we're saying is impermissible. And in fact, any faithful Muslim who hears it is entitled to kill us for engaging in it. Now, what the Islamists have been doing in their pre-violent phase for over 10 years now, through the work of an organization that you probably have never heard of, most people in Washington certainly haven't, but it's actually one of the most powerful in the entire world. It's called the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, or OIC. And in December of 2005, they launched what they called a 10-year program of action to get through the United Nations, over which they exercise great influence because they've got 57 members of the United Nations, and many of them got a lot of money because we keep incredibly transferring petrodollars to them. But they've used that power, they've used that influence to get the United Nations Human Rights Council to adopt a resolution called 1618 to call upon every nation in the world to prohibit and criminalize speech that defames religion. Only, as Paul says, and as you know, you can defame Christians all day long, right? Jews, Zoroastrians, Buddhists, Hindus. There's one religion you are not allowed to defame on pain of death. Look at those folks in Paris, Charlie Hebdo. So here's the point. When you hear people telling you, you mustn't say these things, you mustn't preach in your pulpits about it, you mustn't work within your faith community, you mustn't resist what they're trying to do inside your faith community, you need to know that's the leading edge of the jihad to bring Sharia here, starting with the Sharia blasphemy restrictions.
Wow, man, let me ask this, because there's a couple of angles here when we begin to talk about these issues, and I want to make sure I got everything from Edward Snowden, technology and security, to where should we be, to the point of, in this current administration, a lot has been said. A lot of stuff is thrown around. A lot of stuff is saying, hey, you know, there's this Muslim thing, and he's more open to Muslims versus Christians. And what's fact or fiction? Let me ask you this. What's fact, what's fiction from where we are today, current administration, in terms of this whole Muslim side and the infiltration of these kind of ideas and penetrations in where we are in our government? We heard our speaker this morning just talk about just our security and where we are from being secure. And so what do we be
just
thinking
take
about?
a cut at that first. This weekend, folks, you were treated to this. Now, I don't mean just the attacks, of course, in New York and New Jersey and Minnesota. I mean the practical application of Sharia blasphemy laws. Did you hear everybody say, the mayor of New York, the president of the United States, the FBI guys, everybody say, this has nothing to do with terrorism, folks. No terrorism here. Nothing to see here. Move along. Until, the evidence just continued to accumulate that, of course, these were jihadists. They'd come to this country as part of their hijra, the migration, the colonization. They'd become naturalized American citizens, and they engaged in jihad. And I encourage you to look at the Wall Street Journal today. They have an article that talks about how the experts just can't figure out what is motivating these people. It's not that they're poor, which is one of the things that we were told. It's not that they're alienated from society. It's, well, we just can't figure this out. And in part, Derek, to your question, that is the culmination of now at least 15 years under both Republican and Democratic administrations, I'm sorry to say, of what's become known as willful blindness.
Wow.
But it's also, truth be told, and we've got a lot of materials if you're interested in more in any of this, securefreedom.org is a repository of information about this civilization jihad. And it really speaks to this point that when the Muslim Brotherhood is allowed to help define what our policies are, Hillary Clinton being a prime example of this, her right-hand person for 17 years is a Muslim Brotherhood operative, in my judgment, by the name of Huma Abedin. Well, there you have someone who is making policy to our detriment.
I'm sorry. You just said somebody with Hillary has been there for
17 years.
17
Well, for 20
years.
years. Wasn't she an intern in the mid-90s with her?
17, I think, but
Yeah.
it may be 20. Look, here's the point, folks, and this may sound, as you say, stirring the nest. Sorry. This nest does need to be stirred.
Yes.
We have 40-some days in which to decide whether we're going to do more of the same and worse, frankly, because I believe Hillary is even more immersed in this notion of Islamic supremacism and enabling it, even than Obama, hard as that is to believe. Or we're going to see whether we might get a different course. And I just hope you guys are not going to sit this one out. And I hope you're going to encourage your faithful parishioners not to sit this one out, because I don't think we get another chance, frankly, to get this piece at least right, and a lot of other things as well.
Yep. No, of course I got to give the Cure perspective of, wherever people may fall from their political vantage point and their viewpoint and where things are, What we're talking about is just understanding national security, how this fits in, who's aligned with who. Because, see, sometimes in our world, we think if they're a jihadist or if they're a Muslim, they got to look a certain way. You know, after 9/11, there was a lot of people on a plane, you know, you're flying and you're like looking to the person next to you, making sure, you know, if anybody looked a little bit curious or Middle Eastern or whatever else may be the case, there was a profiling that took place. Today, it doesn't seem like it's quote unquote meeting a profile. It's folks almost from just anywhere in our country coming up out of the woodworks, and here we go.
Mm-hmm. Well,
People that are in our government as well.
in the leadership, and we're always told these folks are the leaders of the Muslim community. And by the way, there's something very helpful in this document, again, written by a Muslim Brotherhood leader, reporting back to the headquarters in Egypt. He had a list of 29 groups on page 30 and 31. 29 groups. This is 1991, mind you now. There's many, many more than that now. But even today, this is the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood's infrastructure in America. And just to give you a specific example, I'll turn it over to Paul. The Sunday before Labor Day, this Labor Day, a man many of you may know, Jay Johnson, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, went to the annual convention of the group that is listed as number 1 under the heading, Our Organizations and Organizations of Our Friends, the Islamic Society of North America. He was asked afterwards, did the Secretary know, the spokesman, did the Secretary know that this group was associated with the Muslim Brotherhood? Did he know that it was an unindicted co-conspirator in the largest terrorism financing trial in U.S. history? And the answer was, oh, yes, he knew. Oh, yes, he knew, and he wanted to go there because he wanted to reach out to Muslims. Now, here's the point, ladies and gentlemen. Again, forgive me, Paul, but the point is, if the kinds of Muslims that are in the Islamic Society of North America Convention are, I believe, without exception, on the wrong side of that fault line of Sharia, if they embrace it, if they believe it, if they want to practice it, if they think they should live under it, and more to the point, they think you should live under it, those aren't the kind of people you want to be reaching out to. Right. You want to be reaching out to Muslims who are not welcome there, and frankly, who have not been welcome in the Obama White House or the Clinton State Department.
Wow. There's so many points I could make from there, but just because that leads in perfectly into one I was just thinking of, and making these points made me distinctly unpopular at my church recently when I spoke on it, because half the people in my church just didn't want to hear this. But polls over the last couple of years, the last 4 years, we're not talking polls from Breitbart or sources that the left could question, but polls from like the Pew Charitable Trusts, major think tanks, universities have shown consistently that either a sizable minority or an outright majority, and sometimes a huge majority of Muslims, we're not talking in Pakistan and Saudi, but in Canada, in Europe, in the United States, see as fundamentally inconsistent, and in my view they accurately see it this way, being a Muslim and living in our Western society. Many of them say they would rather live under Sharia law than under the U.S. Constitution. We're not talking 2%. I don't have the numbers in my head, but it was a minimum of all these polls of a quarter and sometimes 3/4 of Muslims, depending on the country and the question, that said this. So this is not just an issue of, as some would have you believe, that there is just a very, very small fringe in Islam. No, this is a widespread problem. Why that is takes a lot of history you don't have time to go into, but part of it is education coming out of Saudi Arabia, the Wahhabis, petrodollars funding it, textbooks that are virulent. That's the short 10-second version.
But a quick follow-up. To that point, keeping Muslims from assimilating and being part of the fabric of America and Europe and Canada and Australia and so on is the mission of something called the Institute for Muslim Minority Affairs. What, you might ask, is the Institute for Muslim Minority Affairs?
Yes.
It is the Abedin family business in Saudi Arabia, with whom her father, her mother, her sister, her brother, and Huma Abedin herself have been associated
Yep.
throughout
It's
its
hard
life.
to argue that those are false charges. The evidence is so overwhelming that Huma and her family are
Indisputable.
Islamists.
Indisputable.
Yeah.
Her mother's a very senior member of the Muslim Sisterhood, as they call it, which is the other side of the brotherhood. But here's the point. Paul's exactly right. We would welcome, I think all of us, and do, Muslims who want to be part of America, who want to help it grow and be better, freer, more tolerant, enjoying religious pluralism, and all of the other benefits that flow from what is fundamentally our Judeo-Christian tradition. They're not the problem, but they are increasingly endangered species within their own community, particularly to the extent that we keep legitimating and citing these guys as their leaders. There's no space in their community for them. They're considered, by us maybe, good Muslims. They're considered apostates by the Islamists. They need our help, frankly.
Yep. And I'm going to raise another point. I know that we're running out of time here, but especially as Christian clergy, I think that you all will appreciate this fact. One of the major differences between Islam and Christianity, we know some of the major theological differences, but this is one thing many of us haven't thought of, is an ethical difference. When you look at what makes a good Muslim, and I thought of this because Frank raised the issue of what is considered a good Muslim. When you look at what makes a good Muslim is determined in the Muslim world overwhelmingly by outward actions, by whether or not they pray bowing toward Mecca, they do the Hajj, they fast during Ramadan. Those are outward actions. Those are not an ethical framework for living one's life. That's a major difference with Christianity. That's why you have people like Al-Qaeda and ISIS that can be considered good Muslims, because they do all those outward actions, but they behave abominably and they kill people and do horrible things.
They follow Sharia.
Exactly. Major difference between the two religious systems.
Wow.
And also, I want to get at another point I thought of earlier, which I want to get at, is Frank raised this point too, and I wanted to buttress what he said about why they hate the United States. It's not so much our constitutional freedoms and the other things, although that is a problem. Their primary reason they hate us is simply because we're not Muslim. And when you look at open source intelligence, you don't need to have signals intelligence or some sort of great, deeply embedded spy in ISIS territory to tell you this. It's kind of obvious because they publish it. The August issue of ISIS's very slickly produced journal had an article that just laid out why we hate you, because you're not Muslim. He just said it. I think we need to take them at their word.
Wow. So what is it with, why do they keep saying, you need to, the U.S. needs to stop bombing them? And as they talked about in the Florida nightclub shootings and this whole jihad side of things, and you hear this kind of rhetoric at different times.
Well, we're supposed to submit. That's the point. Resistance, or fitna, as they call it, is an abomination under Sharia and under the practice of Islam as it's defined. So whether it's bombing them or whether it's occupying Muslim lands, as Israel does, for example, as we have done in Iraq and Afghanistan, or whether it's just being us, not being Muslim, not submitting. I mentioned that business about the people of the book. The Zoroastrians, the Hindus, the Buddhists, and so on get even worse treatment than the Jews and Christians do, as you may know. I mean, there's no choice. They either convert to Islam or they die. The people of the book get a special third option, which is they can become what are known as dhimmis, slaves. And this isn't just sort of second-class citizens, which is not all that attractive, even if that were it. It is, in fact, living at the sufferance of the jihadists. You must pay a tax, but you must also not give offense. There's no churches, there's no outward practice of your faith, there's no cross-wearing, none of the things that might offend the sensibilities of the Islamic supremacists. So, I mean, this is a death struggle, I'm afraid. Again, not with all Muslims so far, but again, with those who believe it is God's will to make us all submit and to, by the way, dominate all of those Muslims and bend them to their will as well.
Let me ask you a question, and this is a question that's here. Why has not only the Obama administration, but also, as you mentioned before, there's been Republican administrations that have been so sympathetic to this Islam thing, and why is that sympathy there?
Well, if I could take a first cut at it, there's a long history here, which I would be happy to share with you at whatever length you'd like. There's actually a course that we've put together that explains it at MuslimBrotherhoodInAmerica.com. But I believe that in the days leading up to the election of George W. Bush, and then actually most especially on and in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, President Bush, first candidate Bush, then President Bush, was subjected to a Muslim Brotherhood influence operation that was extraordinarily successful. And when in the critical hours after that horrific attack in this city and in New York, the president reached out to and embraced Muslim leaders who he was told were the people who would keep this from being a clash of civilizations. If he only did two things, really. One, he was seen with them, so it wasn't an anti-Muslim response. And secondly, he would just say some things that would really resonate with the Muslim ear, like, I don't know, Islam is a religion of peace. Jihad is about personal struggle. It's not about holy war. And how about this one? The people who were hijacking those planes are trying to hijack a great Abrahamic faith, and they have nothing to do with Islam. Now that began, sounds a lot like Barack Obama, doesn't it? But this actually began on 9/11, and I believe corrupted and undermined his pursuit, I think truly well-meaning pursuit of the defense of freedom, because he too was being suborned by the Muslim Brotherhood. In fact, I was with a colleague who was in the government during these years, in the beginning of the Obama administration. I'll just leave you with his short form of what happened. He said that during the Bush years, Muslim brothers were in the meetings. During the Obama years, Muslim brothers were running the meetings. And that's how the civilization jihad works.
Wow. Well, let me tell you.
Got a lot of questions?
Oh, yeah. Some FBI say there's no way to win the caliphate. What do you say?
No way to defeat the caliphate?
No way to defeat it. Right, exactly.
Of course there is. Yeah, of course there is. There's through kinetic force. That's got to be part of it, but obviously not the whole answer, because the biggest answer, again, as someone who is a historian, but I've also done a couple of degrees in theology and theological ethics, and so I realize that meeting the deepest needs of the human soul is going to be ultimately the thing that's going to minimize and to neutralize their hostility. It's the only thing that's going to do it. It's a spiritual problem at root, not a national security problem. That's the symptom. We need kinetic force, we need, clearly, but we also need to have a diplomacy that realizes that there's some deeper forces at play here. We also need a historical meta-narrative that counters that of the Islamists, which again, as I mentioned early on in our talk, is one of 1,400 years of victimization, the bloodthirsty Christians, et cetera, et cetera. So I have some friends that are working on that. An Iraqi gentleman I know has gotten together numerous historians, including some friends of mine, who have access to about 2 million young netizens in Iraq that are young Iraqi Muslims that don't have, that would like other sources of information on their culture's history, and we're trying to give them content that counters the Islamists. So that's one thing we can do. We can try to counter that meta-narrative of victimization to try to reduce the field from which the Islamists draw the recruits by reducing the hate.
Wow.
There's a number of other things, but that's just a very, very brief synopsis.
And I would just say, we have no choice.
Yeah.
It is a zero-sum thing.
Yeah.
The caliphate wins or we survive.
Yep. I'm an eternal optimist. Maybe I shouldn't be.
No.
Maybe I'm just too young so that I'm still naive. But I mean, truly, with my reading of history as well, I believe that, and of the scriptures, there's always a chance. It's looking pretty dark, but there's always a chance because God can do anything with us partnering with Him. So again, it's the task of, that's why Frank said at the very, very beginning of our talk, you guys are on the front lines. Frankly, that's utterly true. I mean, far more important than anything Frank or I do in the national security and foreign policy sphere is what you guys do at the community level in trying to save the fabric of our nation.
Amen.
Well, you're asking the final question here, or answering it, and I'm going to have to do this thing. No, it's fine. In 30 seconds, right? I'm going to give you a double header in 30 seconds, and both of y'all can respond for 30 seconds. And but what are some of the ways we clergy can address this influx of Muslim Brotherhood in our communities? And does this also mean we shouldn't evangelize Muslims on the wrong side of Sharia? That's a 30-second response. I'm going to give you guys a challenge.
We should always evangelize.
There we go.
Of course. Again, combining my history and theology, when you look at American history, what's formed our national identity? Our Christianity, our Judeo-Christian values. That really shaped our political history primarily through two great awakenings. We need a third. We need a third great awakening. That's the bottom line.
Third great awakening. I love it. It's 20.
Your people will define the future, I
Wow.
believe. The people that you inspire and lead will help determine the choice that we're about to make in this pivotal national election. And I don't mean to sound blatantly partisan about this, I'm not. I'm just saying the choice we've laid before you is one of victory over jihad or submission. And I hope that you'll consider signing on to this letter. It's just beginning with you, quite frankly. But we're going to take this across the country and see if we can get faith leaders who will be a bulwark against interfaith dialogue and bridge building that not only prevents evangelizing within the community that we need to reach, yes, on the dark side of Sharia, but actually is enabling that dark side to dominate you and your communities.
Wow.
This is the fundamental choice of our time, and I'm prayerful that you will rise to it, and that in so doing, you will lead the rest of us to do so as well.
Wow.
Thanks for having me.
Let's give them a warm welcome and warm thank you. Sorry. Really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Appreciate that.